Advent is maybe something that's a new concept to some of us. So if you're unfamiliar with it, Advent has traditionally been this kind of 4-week period that the church recognizes as a time of waiting. And there's a couple reasons for that. On the front end, we believe that the Bible is not just sort of a nice collection of ancient literature, but it's actually God's story that he has written for us to understand how the world works. And part of that story is this anticipation that the majority of the Bible, the Old Testament, of these people who were waiting and longing and yearning for God to act. They were holding tight in hope to the promises that he had made all the way from the fall of humanity in Genesis to the coming of Christ in Matthew. And so there's this aspect to Advent in which we enter into the story symbolically in this time of anticipation and waiting and yearning and longing for God to act. But for us, on the other side of the cross, on the other side of Jesus, it has this additional meaning because we know what God has done. Many of us have experienced the beautiful redeeming work of Jesus. And yet, as we look around, we see that things are not complete. Many of us have experienced that wholeness, that freedom that comes from our relationship with Jesus, and yet we can look around at the world that's a mess, at our families that are a mess, even at parts of our own life that are still a mess. And so there's this kind of this already not yet reality. And so not only is Advent a chance for us to symbolically enter into the story of God as we kind of anticipate and look to what the Old Testament was longing for in the fulfillment of Christ, but it's also a chance for us as Christians to enter into a stage of lament and look at the state of the world and recognize that our heart's cry is still, "Come, Lord Jesus, come." And we look forward to his return when he will renew all things. And so Advent is really not just a time of yearning, but it's a time of hope. It's a time where we look at the things that Jesus has brought about through his life, death, burial, resurrection. We celebrate those things and we long for those things to come in their fullness. And traditionally, it's been focused around 4 key terms: hope, joy, love, and peace. And I don't know if it's particular in that order, but today we're going to look at the first of those, and that is hope. And the way that we're going to do that is we're actually going to jump into the book of Matthew. For those of you who are suddenly getting like a little bit of PTSD, because if you're new with us, you're like, what is he talking about? Like, why is that a big deal? We've been walking through the book of Matthew for the last 3 years, and we're in like chapter 26, so we're super close to the end, and we're jumping back today into Matthew chapter 1, but I assure you, we're not starting through the book of Matthew again. We are simply using this as a chance to engage this Advent season together. So if you have your Bibles, open them up to Matthew chapter 1. If you don't have a Bible, we got a couple over there. Please grab it, take it home. It's yours, our gift to you. Of course, you can always download a Bible app on the App Store on your phone. I'm going to read through part of Jesus' genealogy. Just show of hands, how many people like read through a list of names in the Bible and are like, why is this in here? This is super boring. Like, anyone? All right, so like 5 of you are telling the truth, and the rest of you are like, I am not going to say that the Bible's boring because I don't want to be struck down. It's okay. You're allowed to find parts of the Bible boring. That is actually okay. That's normal. People who are scholars who like put their heart and soul into understanding this, look at this and be like, there's a lot of names. This is hard to read. But it's not unintentional. It's actually really important. So I'll start off here in chapter 1, verse 1. It says this, Matthew writes, "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Matthew wants to start off his entire book by rooting Jesus' history and person in God's promises and works in the nation of Israel. So he starts off with Abraham. God made a covenant to Abraham, a promise to Abraham that through him he was going to bless all the nations through his family line. And God continues to fill that promise out in the quintessential king of Israel and King David. And the rest of this list is going to trace that history down. So he goes on and says this in verse 2, Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. I want to stop us here. there's a couple things that we need to understand. Jesus grew up, first century Judaism, patriarchal society, ancient Hebrew culture, patriarchal society. What that means is that if you're a dude, you matter. If you're a lady, you matter less. Nothing, hey? Probably if you're a woman in 2021, you're like, that does not seem right. And indeed, it may not be right. And yet, there's this reality that this is the culture that was there. But Matthew does something very interesting. Interspersed in this genealogy are a number of women. We start off with this first one, Tamar. He's going to go on to talk about Ruth and Rahab and the wife of Uriah, all the way down to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And what's really interesting is we have to ask the question, okay, this would have been normal for someone in Jesus' time to trace the family lineage down through the men, but Matthew adds these little lines about these women. And these aren't just, like ordinary, average, like amazing, women. Like these are women with messy histories. We'll fill out Tamar today, but we have Rahab, a prostitute, Ruth, a foreigner, a Moabite who, as we'll see in a couple of weeks, was someone who was detested by the Israelites, who was seen as an idolater, worshiping other gods. And then we have Uriah's wife. They don't even name her, but probably if you're familiar with the Bible, you would know her as Bathsheba. At best, well, maybe that's not her. Giving her the most charity, she was the victim of a rape. Giving her least charity, she was a participant in an affair. This is a messy group of names. And yet, for some reason, Matthew wants us to understand that these women are a key part of Jesus' history. They don't fit the bill that the people in his day and age would think through. They're predominantly foreigners, people who have worshipped other gods, who've been part of nations that have traditionally been the nations that Israel's to avoid because they worship the wrong things and do the wrong things, oftentimes colored with sexual brokenness. And yet Matthew wants us to understand that these women are part of Jesus' family lineage and that it's important for us. So I want to unpack this a little bit today. We're going to jump into Genesis chapter 38, and I'm going to try and move through this quickly, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm not going to read through all of it. I'm going to kind of jump around and summarize parts of it. But Genesis chapter 38 is a story of Tamar. And in order for us to understand what's going on in this story, we have to understand what's happened so far. So Adam and Eve, God creates them. They sin. God casts them out of the garden. And then God starts his rescue plan. He promises that Eve is going to have someone who comes from her lineage, that she's going to bear a child, or a child's going to come through one of her descendants who's going to crush the serpent that was part of that sin that happened. But he was going to get bitten by the heel, and then that kind of continues on. We go through Noah. Noah gets chosen, and we get down to this guy named Abraham. And God meets with Abraham. He chooses him from within. He pulls him from out of the nations. And he says, I'm going to make a promise to you, Abraham, that I'm choosing you. And through your family line, I am going to bless you so that you can be a blessing to all the nations. Abraham has a son named Isaac. Isaac has a couple of sons. And this is a messy family. Again, it's not like your beautiful, like picture perfect, 2.4 kids, nice white picket fence kind of family. This is a messy family. Jacob is one of Isaac's sons. I mean, he's a cheat, he's a liar, he's conniving, and yet God meets with him, calls him, and tells him that he's going to continue and carry through Abraham's promise through him. He goes on to have not one, not two, but 4 wives, from which he fathers 12 kids, and one of those kids is a man named Judah. And Judah is a bit of a piece of work. Up until this point, what we know of Judah is that he has been jealous with his other brothers of his younger brother Joseph. him and his brothers throw Joseph into a well, an empty well, so that he will die. And then he thinks, oh, you know what? No, we can profit from this. Some slave traders are coming around. I'm going to sell Joseph. He's the one who comes up with the idea to sell Joseph to the slave traders so that they can come. And then he goes and lies to his dad and says, hey, Dad, I found Joseph's special coat that you gave him. It's all ripped up and bloody. He must have died. So he sells his brother into slavery, lies about it. And when we get to this story, this is kind of what happens next. It says in verse 38, chapter 38, verse 1, that he leaves his brothers and he goes to stay with a man in Adullam named Hira. And he looks around. He's like, oh, there's this girl I like, and she's a Canaanite. Now, again, if you're familiar with the Bible story, you know that the Canaanites are like bad news. They're like, avoid those people. Like, they worship other gods. They're going to corrupt you. You don't want to kind of associate with them. And what does he do? He marries a Canaanite. And through this Canaanite woman, he has 3 sons. He has a son named a son named Anan, and a son named Shelah. Well, as time goes on, his sons get older, as sons do, and it comes time for him to get his sons married off. So it says in verse 6 that Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, and the Lord put him to death. This may sound harsh. This may trouble us, but there's something to really understand here. See, God is taking his promises and his plans seriously. He's called Abraham and his family to be this source of blessing to the nations, to be a holy people set apart for him. And he's calling them to that, and he will discipline them when they fail to live out that calling. There's this interesting custom that was an ancient custom. It's called the Levorite Laws. Basically, there was this idea that, if you were a guy, you needed to perpetuate your name. And so if you were the oldest son in a family and you passed away before you had kids, your name was still it was left hanging. And so it was up to your family to make sure your name didn't disappear. And so if you left a wife, then your brother had to essentially sleep with her, get her pregnant so that she could have babies, and then they would be kind of given over to her to kind of raise under her the man's name. So this is what happens. Verse 8, then Judah said to Anan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. I'm just going to straight up say this. If there are kids here, this is not like your PG-13 Bible story. This is not like the nice Sunday school story that you get. It's going to get a little bit risque here, okay? But Anan knew that the child would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, and so the Lord put him to death also. God had this calling, this purpose, this plan for the children of Abraham. He called Abraham to be the father of many nations, to be fruitful and multiply. He was going to bless Abraham and his family so that they in turn would be God's means of blessing the world around them. So it's interesting when you look at what Anan's doing here, and we have to assume that this message has been passed down from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob's sons, to their sons. Gordon Wenham, who's a scholar who has studied the book of Genesis, he explains it this way. He says, in Anan's case, it is especially reprehensible, the spilling of his semen on the ground, for God's repeated promise to the patriarchs, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, was that he would make them fruitful and multiply. So Anan is thus deliberately frustrating the fulfillment of those promises. The threefold references to descendants, or in our translation to, I think the word that he uses is offspring. that indeed must allude to these promises, and Onan's actions demonstrate his opposition to the divine agenda. For this reason, the Lord let him die. What Wenham wants us to understand is that Onan's not just simply mistreating his sister-in-law, which he is indeed doing, but he's actually acting in deliberate rebellion to the purpose and calling of God. This is the story that Tamar is made known in. And I want us to just think about how Tamar must feel. She gets given to a man whose son is evil. We don't know what that means. We don't know what his evil was. But perhaps at the very least, he did not treat his wife very well. And then she gets given to this man, and we have to understand something. Like her job, her purpose, her essence in being able to enter into society would be to be one who would help bring about a family. Like her status actually relied on her ability to build a family. So what Onan is essentially doing is he's treating her like garbage, like a piece of property there for his own pleasure, like a hooker. He has no problem using her for his own pleasure, but he gives her nothing in return. He offers her nothing. He does not allow her the dignity of moving forward and building a family line, which would have been a huge part of her identity and role in this culture. She is used and abused and pushed aside. After Onan dies, Judah tells her, okay, I have one more son. His name's Shelah. Hold tight. He's not old enough. So you can't sleep with him yet because he's not there. But when he gets old enough, you will have the opportunity to continue on. So she has this last little shred of hope. This last little shred of hope that she will be able to rebuild her life, to be able to enter into society as a fully functioning part of that culture. And yet it doesn't happen. We read later on that Shelah does indeed grow up, and yet Judah does not give him to Tamar. I want to stop us here for a second because there's this very personal aspect to what's going on. And I want to just invite us to consider the person of Tamar and to ask, is there anyone here, anyone who's watching and you get where Tamar's at? Like you understand, like you're hearing this and you're like, oh man, I know how this woman must feel. You know what it's like to be used by other people. To be treated like a cigarette, smoked and then thrown on the ground. Maybe you know what it's like to be Tamar. You know the sting of abuse. Maybe, like Tamar, you have this shred of hope, and yet at the same time, you feel forgotten, discarded, pushed aside, inconvenient to those around you. For some of us, maybe we don't quite have that personal sense, but there's this other dynamic that's going on. Because we have to remember that this story is rooted in this larger narrative about God fulfilling his plans to bring the restoration of humanity. God promised Abraham that he would do it through his family line. And it kind of seems like we're hitting a roadblock here. Judah is supposed to bear children that can continue to bring about this blessing. And what's happening? It's not happening. And it kind of seems like God's plans are being frustrated. And for some of us, maybe we're not in the Tamar space in the sense that we're looking around and we feel discarded and pushed aside, but maybe we're looking around at the world around us and we're starting to wonder, like, God, do you really know what you're doing? Because as I'm looking at this, circumstances seem to be telling me that things are not going according to plan. Life is out of control. Whichever place that you find yourself, it seems like hope is fleeting. That it might even be shattered. And we don't know what to do next. I believe that not only did Tamar have this personal reality that she was living through, but as someone who had come into the family of Abraham, she knew the promises that God had made to his people. And in a sense, she was able to step into those promises by being incorporated into that family, to be brought into the blessing of God, the promises of God, the purpose of God, and then all of that seems lost as she's cast aside. Story continues. Good old Judah, his wife eventually passes away, and after, an appropriate time of mourning, he decides he wants to have a little bit of a bachelor party. And so he goes down to shear his sheep with a buddy. And Tamar hears about this. And she's like, man, you promised me that you would, that I would get to be married to Shelah, that I would be able to continue to build my status as a person in society, but more than that I would be able to be part of God's purposes and plans to bring blessing to the world. And Judah doesn't do that. And so she hears about this. And this is where it gets really bizarre. And I'm not going to try and sugarcoat this for you. It's messy. It says here, again, I'm just going to summarize this, that she takes off her widow's clothes and she puts on a veil, and she basically gets her, she gets dolled up, and she plops herself down at this basically like the functional truck stop, and waits for her father-in-law to pass by. And he does, and he thinks she's a prostitute. And so she goes up to him, or he goes up to her and he says, hey, what will it cost me to get this going on? And she's like, I want a goat. He said, well, I don't have a goat with me, but I can get you one. And so she says, well, you need to give me a deposit. And he says, what do you want? And she's like, well, you give me your staff and your seal. And this was important because the staff and the seal were these items of authority and prominence. It was the way by which Judah could basically show his status. And so he's like, sure. You hold on to those and we'll do the deed. And then when I come back this way, I'll bring you a goat. So they sleep together. And she's wearing a veil so he doesn't recognize her. And she gets pregnant. Now, he goes down, sends a guy to pay her off, doesn't find her. So now he doesn't want to get embarrassed, so he doesn't try and track her down. And then it says in verse 24, about 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, is guilty of prostitution. And as a result, she is now pregnant. So again, Judah, he's the one who unknowingly sleeps with his daughter-in-law, but he thinks she's a prostitute. So he's guilty of sleeping around. He finds out his daughter-in-law is pregnant. This is his response. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. Ladies, I just want to say, you better thank Jesus every day that you were born in this era and not in these ancient times, because it was not awesome to be a woman back then. And this is his response. He's like, do away with her. This is my chance. She's been an inconvenience. I have to kind of hold her in this, I don't know. She's basically betrothed to his son, but she's a widow. She can't really move forward. She's just this inconvenience off the side. Now is his chance to just get rid of her. So that's what he wants to do. He wants to have her burnt. And so he sends people to grab her. And as they're bringing her out, she says in verse 25, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. So she hands it to the guys. And then there's this fairly profound thing that happens. Judah recognized in verse 26 and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again. This story is such a mess. Like, it's like Jerry Springer meets Maury meets this is like, and this is the Bible. Like the nice, Jesus loves me. This is messy. Like, even by we live in an era where everything goes, and yet even by the modern stretch of the imagination, like seducing your father-in-law is that's still a pretty big no-go. And yet, Judah says this thing. He says, Tamar was more righteous than I. He lifts her up. He sees that she has done something. It's weird. It's a mess. But in some way, she was actually doing something right. What was that thing? I believe what Tamar did, it wasn't just this, desire to get pregnant for pregnancy's sake. There's this contrast that we're supposed to see here between Judah and his sons and Tamar. Judah's sons do everything they can to avoid bearing children, and Tamar does everything she can to do it. Because she understands the calling and the promises and the purposes of God for this family. Where Judah and his sons don't take seriously the calling of God, Tamar does. She understands that God has chosen this people, that he wants to work through this people to bring about his restoration for humanity. And she, in an act of desperation, clings to that hope, acts on that hope, throws herself towards that hope. And make no mistake, this wasn't like an easy thing for her to do. As you saw, it could have gone wrong at many points. Judah could have said, I don't recognize this steel and staff. Burn her. She could have got caught while she was dressed up as a prostitute. There's so many things that could have gone wrong in this process, and yet she was willing to risk it all, not just simply to have a baby, but to be part of the promises that God had made as an act of obedience to the command he had given. And if you are here today and you are clinging onto hope, and you get Tamar, you get being pushed aside, you get feeling isolated, you get feeling abused and used, the invitation of this story to you is to cling to Jesus. To cling to Jesus. To cling to the only one who actually has the capacity to bring about something good in this. And maybe again, you're looking around and you don't have the same personal experience that Tamar experienced, but you understand the looking around and looking at the world is not going as it should be. It seems like God's plans are being frustrated. Again, the only invitation here for you is to cling in hope to Jesus. It could have been very tempting for Tamar to look to something else. She could have said, I'm done with this family, I'm going to run away, I'm going to build a new life for myself. She could have just said, I'm going to keep holding on to this Shelah thing. Maybe eventually Judah will wise up. I don't know. There's many things that you and I can cling to, can look to for our hope. But none of them can do what only God and his goodness can do. And here's why. Because not only do we see in Tamar a model of what it looks like to go through dark circumstances and cling to the promises of God and the purpose of God and the plan of God in the midst of those, but we actually see a picture of what God is like. In her life and her actions, Tamar foreshadows the work of Jesus. Like Tamar, Jesus was rejected unjustly. Like Tamar, despite that rejection, Jesus chose to pursue obedience to God. Even at great personal risk and cost to himself. See, Jesus, though, is much greater than Tamar, because though Tamar put herself in harm's way, potentially, Jesus actually put himself in harm's way practically. He went to the cross, and he died, suffered for us. There's this third thing, though, I think that we need to understand. This is, as I said, as you heard, it's a messy story. It's a broken story. It's not a great picture of like good people. And yet, it's part of Jesus' family history. It's part of the means by which God actually brought about his plan for rescuing humanity. And that should give us great hope. Because what it means, what it shows us, is that God is a God who can redeem the broken things for his good purposes. The cross tells us that. The cross tells us that. What is the cross? The cross is the evil of humanity pouring itself out on God, literally putting God to death. The worst, most brutal, sinful, rebellious act of humankind. But what does God do with that brokenness? Man, that's the means by which he actually saves us, brings about our forgiveness, adopts us as sons and daughters. Tamar's story is messy and broken, and yet God uses it to bring about his purposes and his plans. Her life is broken, but God actually uses her story to bring about change and transformation and redemption. I want to kind of give you just two quick things before I finish off here. There's an interesting thing. We have this interplay between Tamar and Judah. I kind of shared with you earlier just what a dirtbag Judah has been up to this point. If you follow along in Genesis, you're going to continue to move along in the story of Joseph. Like we have this Tamar thing and then gets back into the Joseph narrative. There's this interesting thing that happens. Judah and his brothers, they're walking through a famine. They go down to Egypt where Joseph, the brother they sold in slavery, has been staying. And they don't know it's him. And Joseph wants to kind of test them. And so he holds on to one of their brothers and sets this whole scene up. Basically, Judah has this complete change of character. He literally puts himself on the line. He tells his father when they need to bring his younger brother Benjamin with them that he's like, you can hold like my son as ransom for this one. And then when they're getting stuck and it looks like Joseph is going to like arrest Benjamin, he set it up so it looks like Benjamin is stolen from him. Judah actually comes forward and says, take me instead. The man who is only focused on himself and his own gain is transformed. And the only thing that we have to indicate how that might have come across is this story. See, Tamar's actions, her brokenness, actually brought about change and transformation. It's God's means of bringing change and transformation in Judah. And we come to this beautiful passage at the end of the book of Genesis where Jacob is blessing his sons. And he says this about Judah in chapter 49, verse 10. He says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. Right then, we start to understand that God had purpose, that he was going to bring about his purposes and plans through the line of Judah, through Tamar and her son. She bears children, and they continue on the Abrahamic promise that God has. So I want to finish off here by just inviting us into the invitation of Advent. The theme of this week is a theme of hope. A theme of hope. The story of Tamar is a story where it looks like hope is lost, and yet in an act of desperation, Tamar throws herself into the promises of God, to the purposes and plans in obedience to God's calling on her family's life. And this is the invitation for us. When your life feels like it's falling apart, when you feel cast aside, when you feel too broken, when you wonder, like, how could God ever use me? The story of Tamar reminds you, cling to Jesus. Throw yourself upon Jesus. Cast your hope upon Jesus. When you look around at the world and it looks broken and it looks like you can't even imagine how God could ever work, cling to the hope that you have in Jesus. I want to finish off just with a couple of quick stories of what I think this looks like. I had a friend share a little bit of his story with me the other day. He was sharing that for 10 years, the first 10 years of his marriage, he had secret affairs. And it finally all came to a head. His wife found out, and his relationship was broken. They had one child at the time. His life was falling apart. It was messy. It was broken. It looked like, how could God ever use this situation? And yet it was in that moment where he desperately clung to Jesus. He didn't know if his family would get back together. He didn't know if he would ever be able to have another functioning relationship. All he had was the hope that Jesus could take the broken things and use it for his glory. And my friend's good. And it was through that process that he did indeed redeem those circumstances. That family went through a period of separation, but eventually worked through things and were able to come back together by God's grace, God's leadership, God's goodness. But here's the beautiful thing. That same friend now often gets to walk with men who are struggling in similar ways. See, God took the broken things and he redeemed it for his good purposes. He was the source of hope that my friend needed. Things don't always turn out that way. You know, there's times when you look around and maybe it's not something that you brought about, but something that's been brought about by you. I think of the family who desperately wants to have kids, and it just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. And yet God uses that longing, that yearning to help them create a family for the fatherless, for the orphan, for the foster child, or the kid who needs to be adopted. I think of the person who goes through chronic illness. I had a lady in our church in Edmonton. She had debilitating pain from endometriosis scarring. She could not eat solid foods. And yet I watched as God took that brutal suffering that she experienced, a life that was vastly different than she had hoped for and longed for, and used her in powerful ways to walk with others, to give hope and care to others. God redeemed those broken circumstances for his good purposes. And this is the invitation of Tamar. Cling to Jesus, the one who can take the messy, broken parts of our life and redeem them for his good purposes.